Welcome to this webinar by the Labour Campaign for Human Rights on trade and human rights. My name's Matthew Turner and I'm chair of the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. But before I introduce the event and the speakers, let me just very quickly introduce LCHR, who we are and what we do. We're an entirely volunteer-run campaign within the Labour movement that seeks to put human rights at the heart of Labour Party policy and practice. And as part of our international human rights campaign called Britain and Her Allies, we've been looking at the issue of trade and human rights recently. And we've published a series of briefings on this issue, which are all available on our website to have a look at. The first was on exiting the EU and human rights. We were looking at workers' rights, environmental protections, and the immigration system post-Brexit. Although that briefing was written before the UK-EU deal was announced, it's clearly still relevant, particularly with the recent news about the government's review of employment law in the UK. Although that may have been parked for now, I'm sure they'll be doing something about it in the future. The second of our briefings is what we want to be the foundation of this event, which is on trade deals and human rights. And what we were looking at was the old EU regime, how they tried to put human rights into trade deals. And then how, now that we're taking control of our own trade policy, how we can lead the way in human rights, conditionality and trade with third countries. And although I'm sure Emily will be able to discuss this in more detail with us today, sadly, the government, in our view, has got off to a pretty bad start on that front. The third briefing we've written is on corporate supply chains and human rights. And we'll touch on that, I'm sure, in this discussion as well. We looked at the Modern Slavery Act of 2015, whether that's still fit for purpose, or whether it's time for a new kind of law imposing human rights due diligence obligations on companies to investigate their supply chains to identify and prevent human rights abuses. And then the fourth briefing is to be published soon, so everyone can look forward to that, and it will be on arms sales and military contracts. And as I said, all of these briefings are on our website. But just pausing there before I proceed, I want to very quickly and publicly say thank you to everyone on the LCHR committee who's worked so hard on those briefings and indeed on putting together this event. And we hope to do more events like this going forward. Which brings me on to this event. Now, it couldn't really have been better timed because trade is headline news at the moment. We've got the UK-EU trade deal reached just before Christmas. Around the same time, the EU entered into an investment agreement with China, which has been 7 years in the making. And right now, the trade bill is passing its way through Parliament. And we're in a little gap this week between parliamentary ping pong, or we were last week actually. It's going to be back to the Lords tomorrow. But it's not just trade that's in the news at the also, the link between human rights and trade is in the news. And perhaps more explicitly drawn than it has been in recent history. Perhaps the catalyst for this has been the slow drip feed of horror stories that we've seen coming out of Xinjiang province in China. And there's a question many people are asking as to whether we're a generation right now witnessing a genocide unfold before our very eyes. So it was unsurprising when the House of Lords sent the trade bill back to the House of Commons a few weeks ago that they included in that bill a raft of amendments on human rights, including one from Lord Collins from the Labour Shadow Front Bench on human rights assessments and reporting of trade deals. and as well as that, what's very much in the news, the cross-party genocide amendment. And all of this is happening because more and more people are asking the question of what should the interplay be between our values as a country, and in particular our deep and enduring belief in human rights, and our trade policy. And that really is the question that I hope the panel will be able to focus on today. So with that introduction, let me introduce our speakers this evening. First of all, we are very honoured to be joined by Emily Thornberry MP, the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade. As many of you who've joined this event will know, Emily was a passionate and committed advocate of human rights as Shadow Foreign Secretary. And we at LCHR have been particularly pleased to see all of that follow through into the trade group. We know how much Emily cares about human rights as an issue in trade. Also, we're joined by my friend Rahima Mahmut, who is a Uyghur singer and translator, and the UK project director of the World Uyghur Congress. And I've had the pleasure and privilege of working closely with Rahima over the last year. And I must say that she is a truly brave and inspirational person and human rights activist. We're also joined by David Lawrence, who's a senior political advisor at the Trade Justice Movement, which is a coalition of civil society organizations that campaigns for better trade deals to deliver trade justice rather than simply unbridled, unrestricted, uncontrolled free trade. And then finally, we're also joined by Isabelle Younane, who's a senior advocacy manager at ActionAid UK. And this is a charity which supports women and girls living in poverty around the world. And Isabelle specializes in the impact of current trading practices on women's rights, such as in Bangladesh. And she's the recent author of a report called The Global Force for Good on how the UK can lead on gender equality. And I'll just add too that David and Isabelle are both on the executive committee of the newly formed New Diplomacy Project, which is a brand new group within Labour that's seeking to bring together foreign policy experts to support the Labour front bench. So that is the context. Those are the speakers. The final thing to mention is the format. The format of the event will be as follows. We're going to have 5 to 8 minute introductory speeches from the panelists. Then we'll have a few questions that have been pre-prepared and sent in. And then we'll open up to a Q&A with the audience and have audience questions. And we'll aim to finish by about 7:45. David has to go early, 7:30. So if anyone has questions for David in particular, bear that in mind and we'll try to bump those up the queue. And if you have friends or colleagues who are interested in these issues but can't make it today, then the webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website afterwards. So with all of that, let me hand over to the speakers and we'll go in the following order. We'll start with Emily, then David, then Rahima, then Isabelle. So if I can pass over now to Emily Thornberry.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you everybody at the Labour Campaign for Human Rights for holding this discussion and for inviting me to take part in it. And let me thank you as well for everything that you do across our movement to raise awareness of human rights issues, and in particular to support those of us who go out and talk about those issues frequently with all of your tweets and your letters, and the encouragement that you give at events like this. And I can tell you, that it's hugely important to have that support, because in my experience, one of the hardest things in politics, even inside the Labour Party, is to start speaking out on a human rights issue which isn't widely known and isn't widely being talked about. You have people constantly trying to shout you down, saying that you don't know what you're talking about, or that you're damaging Britain's wider interests, or that you should stick to talking about your own constituency. I mean, I had that 5 years ago when I started speaking out about the situation in Yemen. I had it with Israel and Turkey, Egypt and Cameroon, Venezuela and Honduras. There is always somebody seeking to shut you up when you speak out for basic human rights. And I remember it was almost exactly 2 years ago that I visited the East London Mosque to talk about what was happening to the Uyghurs. And I was criticised for that too. But I look back at what I had to say that day 2 years ago, and every word that I said has been proved to be correct. I said that we saw that what we had seen in China then, hundreds of thousands in mass detention, hundreds of thousands facing cultural re-education, a whole people facing systematic oppression and brutal violence, and all because of their Muslim faith, was all too reminiscent of the worst crimes in the past, where abhorrent prejudice based on religion or race have been allowed to flourish unchallenged. And I also said that as soon as people start to think in that way, as soon as the state starts to act in that way and divide people in that way, we are on a very slippery and dangerous slope. China may be an important partner, I said, and a vital player in the world, but that's all the more reason to demand that they act on human rights abuses, not for us to turn a blind eye to the glaringly obvious. And 2 years on, yes, I welcome the fact that there are more people outside of groups like this one who are talking about what is happening to the Uyghurs and no longer turning a blind eye. But I'll be honest, it fills me with frustration when I look back at the 3 simple demands that I made of government way back in February 2019, and to see how slow action on this has been. I urge them as a bare minimum to stop the sale of surveillance equipment to the authorities in mainland China, something that they didn't even look at until a newspaper expose some 16 months later. I urge the government to take action against British companies whose business activities in Xinjiang were contributing to the human rights abuses, something that they didn't take serious action on until 2 weeks ago. And the most shocking of all, I urge the government to impose Magnitsky sanctions on Secretary of State Chen and the other key CPP office holders responsible for orchestrating these terrible crimes against the Uyghurs, something which the United States eventually did in July last year, but which, incredibly, 2 years after I called for it, the British government still refuses to do. And now, of course, all that inaction, all that denial ends in the grotesque spectacle of Dominic Raab and Liz Truss phoning round Tory backbenchers, cajoling them to vote down the amendment that would give the courts the power to call what is happening to the Uyghurs an act of genocide, and to force the government to revoke any trade deal that they may reach with China. Instead of that amendment, Raab and Truss ask us all to place their trust in them. To place their trust in them. We'll do the right thing by the Uyghurs. We'll take the right and necessary action against China, despite having clearly and consistently demonstrated over the last few years that they cannot be trusted. They cannot be trusted to do anything of the sort, and they should never be trusted again. And the reason this battle over the Genocide Amendment matters so much, a battle that will take place again next Tuesday when the bill returns to the House of Commons, is that, as ECHR have rightly pointed out, the decisions that the government makes on trade outside the European Union and the way those decisions are taken are opening up an entirely new frontier in terms of Britain's responsibility for what happens to human rights overseas, and whether we embrace that responsibility or willfully ignore it. This is not like the decisions that the government takes on arms sales, where there is some legal framework in place. There is some guarantee of parliamentary scrutiny, and there is some right to challenge those decisions in the courts. On the trade agreements that the government is currently signing, we have none of those things when it comes to human rights. On arms trails, these arms sales, the government is obliged to consider whether it's legally permitted to license those exports. on wider trade deals, we're simply left to hope that the government will voluntarily ask itself whether it is ethically willing to extend preferential terms of trade to countries who abuse human rights. And the signs are so far deeply worrying, with the government showing no apparent concern whatsoever for the human rights records of potential trade partners before signing agreements with them, and resisting all attempts over the past year to place legal or parliamentary constraints on its ability to negotiate those deals. And that is not just reflected in the decision that the government recently took in relation to the Genocide Amendment, but as I have said, it is also reflected in much more mundane and equally pernicious way in the trade deal which came into force on the 1st of January to maintain free trade beyond the Brexit transition period with President Biya's regime in Cameroon. The very same day when the United States unanimously approved a resolution condemning the Biya regime for its massacre of civilians, its burning of villages, its mass detention of political opponents, and its use of torture and extrajudicial killings in Cameroon's English-speaking regions. That trade agreement with Cameroon was signed by the government with no apparent consideration over whether it was right or appropriate in light of the actions of the Biya regime. And a full month later, there has not just been no parliamentary scrutiny of that agreement, the agreement itself has still not been made available for Parliament even to read. These are the precedents that are being set when it comes to human rights and the government's new trade agreements. And we are just at the beginning of seeing where this will lead, which is why it is so crucial and so urgent that we mobilize our collective efforts to win the battle next Tuesday and get that Genocide Amendment passed, not just because of the message it would send to the world about our solidarity with the Uyghurs and our revulsion at the actions of the Chinese state, but because of the message that it would send to the British government. And the message has to be that when it comes to their decisions on trade, we are watching and we care. We care if British-made arms are being used to kill children in Yemen as they travel in buses on their way to school. We care if British trade agreements are giving legitimacy and financial support to regimes like Cameroon and Egypt, even as they slaughter their civilians or execute their political opponents. And we care if the government is able to take decisions in all these areas, not just without an ethical mindset or a legal framework, but without even a bare minimum of proper parliamentary scrutiny. So I'm very grateful to ECHR and to all of you for taking part today, for making it clear that you still care, because I cannot state my conclusion any more starkly than this. We may all want to put human rights at the heart of foreign policy and our decisions on arms trades, on arms sales and trade. And that is certainly our commitment for when Labour is back in government. But right now, our collective job is not just to put this train in reverse, but to stop it heading ever more rapidly in exactly the opposite direction. That is going to take a hell of a lot of effort, but that is precisely why we need to come together today and why I'm always very grateful and heartened for your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and appreciate the kind words. David, I know you were due to go next, but because there was so much reference to the Genocide Amendment, I wonder if it's perhaps we go to Rahima next and then come to you after. Is that okay? Is that all right with you, Rahima? Let's do that.
Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this, and Matthew, and all your support as a World Uyghur Congress advisor and Stop Uyghur Genocide campaign. And thanks to Emily. First time I met you, we were on the same panel, Cordoba Foundation event, and you spoke so passionately about the situation, and you condemned China for what they're doing. And I'm ever so grateful. And we really need a lot more MPs, you know, in the parliament. I just wonder if we did have more MPs like you, maybe situation would have been different today. And that was in 2018 or 2019. So it's almost 2 years now. I lost contact with my family in January 2017. And up until now, I don't know what happened to them. All I know is from the news, from the accounts of the survivors and the reports like Dr. Adrian Zenz and the journalists like John Sudwas, Tom Cheshire from the Sky News, and many other reporters that I have been working very closely and doing the translation work. For example, today I just came home half an hour ago working with the BBC whole day, doing the final editing of the piece that is going to be aired tomorrow, and just doing the voiceover of these survivors. And I am living their life, living that nightmare in this country. And I don't feel free. I feel my life is completely taken away from me because of, you know, what has been happening since 2017. And I think only people who experience this can understand. That's why the Jewish people are so vocal about what is happening to Uyghur people. And last week, Holocaust Memorial week, I spoke maybe 6-7 events, different events. It has been extremely emotional. And I know we cannot do anything about Holocaust. It's done. But similar event is happening to my people. This is genocide. And I'm not going to give you any more evidence because it is all, the evidence is there from the leaked documents, from the survivors' accounts of what is happening inside. And we know now up to 3 million of Uyghurs are interned in these so-called re-education camps. It is concentration camps. And we know now over 500,000 Uyghurs have been transported to work as slave labor in cotton fields. Hundreds and thousands more forced to work in factories built inside or alongside the camps. And we know nearly a million children stolen from their parents and taken to secure boarding schools where their language and culture is taken away from them. I watched some of the TikTok video footage of these little kids confused and crying. And these just like our own children. If only these, you know, politicians can consider these people are the human beings. They are just like our own children. And the piece that I have been translating, this is about the mass organized rape in the camps. So like all the genocide, women are always the one that target first. And this is what is happening in this 21st century. And the latest, one of the survivors, Gulbahar Khaitwaji, who's Uyghur now living in France, she revealed about her ordeal, and her book is already published in French. And this is what she said: death lurked in every corner. When the nurse grabbed my arm to vaccinate me, I thought they were poisoning me. In reality, they were sterilizing us. That was when I understood the method of the camps, the strategy being implemented not to kill us in cold blood, but to make us slowly disappear, so slowly that no one would notice. There's so many accounts from the survivors, similar accounts revealing the death in the camps, the torture, the unbearable torture that they have experienced, and they bring the people to the extent that they expect you to lose your complete dignity and your humanity. And the documentary that I worked with Robin Banwell that was aired in 2019, Undercover China's Digital Gulag, and a Chinese official said so openly to this undercover reporter when he was challenged that, don't you think that Uyghur people feel their human rights are being violated? And he said, they don't have human rights. It's not about violating their human right. They just don't have human right. And the same documentary, another Chinese official, not knowing that he was speaking to an undercover reporter, and he said, we need to build a lot of mental hospitals. When these people are released, they are not going to be normal. And that's what exactly how Gulbahar said. He said, women like us, once we've been there, we're never same. And I recently spoke to Sairagul Saudbay, a Kazakh camp survivor, and who was was teacher in the region of Gholja where I come from. And now she is having treatment, heart problem. And I know many other survivors. They all damaged, destroyed. And these are the lucky ones. Now they managed to get out. But we have millions still inside the camps and suffering. And those who are not in the camps, they're 24 hours, their movements are tracked. And everyone is scared or worried. One of the IT intellectual told me, a knock on the door brings frights because you just think maybe they are here for me. So this is a statewide state terror is happening. And the government cannot deny that they don't know it. And they should know by now the Chinese government has been lying all the way up until now, not accepting what is happening, just complete denial. And why this government still not taking any action? It just makes me very, very upset, because they can, in this country, the government can, because the US has already done a lot. Magnitsky sanction, several officials being already sanctioned, blacklisted a lot of companies, entities like Xinjiang Corporation, Xinjiang Production Corporation, COPS, which owned almost all the camps, run the camps, and also behind the slave labor, and the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau also was sanctioned. Therefore, I think this, especially the genocide amendment to the trade bill, really, really is so important. I know this is not designed just for the Uyghur people. This is designed for any, future genocide, that the people like me will have the opportunity, have the chance, have a day in court. At the moment, we know the UN route is completely blocked. And that's why I feel it is so important. We have a group of people, Matthew, know that the campaigners, the advisors, everyone working so hard. We've been working so hard and trying, really hoping that this can pass the Lords tomorrow and then the Commons. And then there will be a day that we can ask the UK court to make a determination. Because we feel we have confidence, we have tons of evidence, mountains of evidence. The party line is from the leaked document. This is what it said. The Uyghurs, they said they're malignant tumor. The religion is mental disease. And it said, you cannot uproot the weeds one by one from the fields. You have to spray chemical and kill them all. And these are the leak from the party documents that break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections. the intent is very clear, it's genocidal. And therefore, I really, really hope that, you know, everyone who are listening can do more. And I am grateful that David and this Labour campaign is doing a lot. They've been leading this human rights campaign, and I'm just so grateful to all of you. And I want you to do more to help the very helpless people. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahima. Every time you speak, it makes it feel so real. And you're so brave to give a voice to your people like this. David, the genocide amendment is obviously one amendment that you've been working on, but you've worked on a number of these Lord's amendments that have tried to put human rights at the center of the trade bill. Do you want to speak to that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Emily and Rahima, for your speeches. It's hard to know how to follow such moving words and harrowing first-hand stories, Rahima, but it is an issue that's very close to my heart. I'm half Chinese and I grew up in China, and I don't talk lots publicly about my links in China because I still have family there, but I can say that China was, I think, even just 15 years ago when I grew up there, a very different place to what it is today. And yeah, the situation has really changed, and I think our trade policy needs to change as well. But I'm going to speak a bit more generally about trade policy and human rights, if that's all right. I work for the trade justice movement. We represent 60 NGOs, faith groups, and trade unions campaigning to make trade work better for people and planet. So a big part of that is trade and human rights and how trade impacts on global human rights. I'm also, as Matthew mentioned, a member of the Labour Party, and I co-chair the New Diplomacy project, along with Isabelle, who's on our committee. So Brexit has happened. We did it. We took back control. We're 32 days in, and I'm sure you all feel a huge sense of control and relief at having regained competence. As part of my job, I sit on the Department for International Trade's thematic working group on trade. And one of the big questions that I think a number of the other NGOs that sit on the group have been asking ourselves is, what is this all for? What is the UK government actually trying to achieve with its new, shiny, independent trade policy? Because it's not really obvious. The aim doesn't seem to be economic. The government's trade policy does not constitute anything like an industrial strategy. If it did, I think we would have seen a very different kind of deal with the EU. The aim isn't obviously free trade either. We've just put up barriers and red tape with the world's largest and wealthiest free trade area. And then when it comes to human rights and the environment and sustainable development, there is a distinct lack of strategy and creative thinking from DIT. These issues tend to be an afterthought, a sort of something that is not at the heart of the government's trade policy when it really could be. But there are plenty of parliamentarians, not just on the opposition benches, who do genuinely care about trade and human rights, and this does present an opportunity for the kind of cross-party collaboration that we've seen on the trade bill, both on parliamentary scrutiny of trade agreements, an amendment which we at TJM helped draft, and of course on the aforementioned genocide amendment. And I think this is where Brexit really does present an opportunity. The UK has, for better or for worse, taken back control of trade policy, and that gives us as civil society an opportunity to try and shape our new policy to benefit global human rights. And as Labour, we have an opportunity to develop a rights-centred trade approach, trade policy as a government in waiting. So there are just three things I wanted to talk about, which I think will be essential to a human rights-centred trade policy after Brexit. The first of these is on human rights conditionality versus human rights clauses. So a traditional approach to human rights and trade has been to try to insert human rights clauses into FTAs. This is an approach adopted by the EU, which many of the UK's rollover deals inherit. And these human rights clauses tend to include very general commitments to principles such as the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and they are to some extent enforceable. In theory, either party can can suspend all or part of a treaty if there is a human rights violation. But in practice, human rights clauses depend entirely on a country's willingness to launch challenges and to be willing to suspend a treaty. And I'm very skeptical that the UK government, as currently formed, will be willing to do this with its partners. It's very difficult to picture Liz Truss suspending a trade deal with the US if migrant children are held in American detention centers, something which, of course, we hope that will now end with Joe Biden. Or indeed, if Vietnamese textile workers work in poor conditions, it's hard to picture the UK suspending that agreement, or indeed with China if there is a future trade deal with China. And as for repeat human rights abusers, a human rights clause in a trade deal makes little sense, because why would we be offering trade preferences to those countries in the first place if we are only going to rescind those immediately afterwards? Which is why at TJM we tend to favor pre-trade deal conditionality. So clear benchmarks that trade partners need to meet if they want to secure preferences. And you can define conditionality in all sorts of ways, more or less stringently. There are different ways of enforcing it. As Emily said earlier, the idea behind the Genocide Amendment is that the High Court defines genocide. So you have a definition independent of government and also independent of the UN, which China can veto. But it doesn't have to be done through the courts. The key thing is that you write it into domestic law so that, unlike human rights clauses in trade deals, you don't have to rely on the government of the day being willing to launch sanctions. And this also makes it easier for politicians to stick to their human rights ambitions without having to stoke diplomatic tensions in the moment. So that's on human rights conditionality. And the second thing I wanted to talk about is on multilateralism. So after Brexit, the UK has more control and more freedom to set its own trade policy, but far less clout on the global stage to actually influence things. So on China, for instance, if the UK put in trade sanctions in response to the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, this may well be very morally laudable, but it's unlikely to achieve as much unless other partners are also brought on board, if other allies were to do the same. And I think this is somewhere an area where Labour can make a positive case for partnership with the EU on foreign policy, which I understand is something still to be worked out in the post-Brexit deal. And there might be ways of working more directly with parliamentarians in other countries. The initiatives like the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, for instance, provide ways for UK MPs to work with German and Japanese and Canadian MPs and representatives around the world who agree with our liberal democratic values, and it's a way of developing united lines on what's going on in China. And I think the need for a multilateral approach to human rights might also affect which trade deals Labour wants to support and oppose over the coming years. So with a TJM hat on, I have concerns about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the UK formally applied to join over the weekend. The TPP is at its heart a neoliberal project which aims to reduce government intervention in economies in East Asia. The deal would have very, very negligible economic benefits to the UK, and there are concerns about its environmental and labour rights impact. But from a geopolitical perspective, partnerships with liberal democracies in East Asia will be essential for global human rights, particularly at a time when many countries are under pressure to give in to China's strategic dominance in the region and their alternative regional trade deal, the RCEP. So I think Labour needs to think very carefully about its approach to Trans-Pacific Partnership, not least because that's a major deal on the horizon for this year, but also think creatively about multilateral means of partnering with like-minded democracies around the world, especially means that aren't just sort of neoliberal trade agreements. And lastly, I wanted to mention investment, which I think is often the sort of overlooked younger sibling in the trade world. But investment is hugely important for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think Matthew alluded to this earlier, but Conservative MPs were very quick to condemn the EU signing an investment agreement with China. But in the UK, we have an investment deal with China already. dates back to 1986. And we also have investment treaties with plenty of other countries with questionable human rights records, like Qatar, Yemen, the UAE, and Russia. And these are all treaties which give these countries favorable investor protection. And I don't think your average China skeptic or Russia hawkish Tory MP is aware that the UK has signed treaties with these countries. And I don't think if these countries were to come before the Commons today that they would pass. But they're out there. And secondly, the UK, specifically London, is a global hub for dirty money. And historically, it has been a place where dictators and corrupt officials hide their assets. And a lot of this would come under investment protection in these agreements. If the government was serious about human rights, we would be looking to clean this up and I think enforce sanctions on FDI in the UK. And thirdly, the system of investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS, is itself a threat to human rights. ISDS allows foreign investors to sue the government for measures which harm their profits. In the past, we've seen firms challenge minimum wage minimum wage raises in Egypt, equalities legislation on race in South Africa, and public health in Germany. All of these have been challenged by firms using these ISDS agreements. And all of these are, in some sense, human rights issues through discrimination, fair labor, public health. And yet the UK continues to champion ISDS, and London is a global hub for ISDS arbitration. Now, I know Labour already has a position against ISDS, but I think there is an opportunity after Brexit to challenge those treaties that we have with countries like China, where there is growing cross-party consensus and concern about human rights abuses. And as with the Genocide Amendment, we might find unlikely allies on the Conservative benches. And yeah, we've talked a lot about China already, but I think Labour does have this opportunity to anticipate and to stay ahead of the Conservatives on China and on human rights, and to hold them to their own standards. We would have let ourselves down if we allow Ian Duncan Smith and Tom Tugendhat to lead the moral argument on this. Too often the government talks the talk on human rights, but then gives the Department for International Trade free rein to do whatever it wants. And when push comes to shove, the government will pick free trade over human rights. And it's up to Labour to make the moral case for a reformed trade policy after Brexit. I will leave it there for now, but I look forward to the discussion later.
Thanks, David. Excellent analysis as ever, and I think we're on the same page with you on all of those points. We've heard from Rahima about the awful consequences for women of what's happening in the camps in Xinjiang. But there's a wider question of what the consequences of trade and trade agreements and trade policy can be for women around the world. And so let's hand over to Isabelle to hear from that perspective when it comes to trade.
Thanks very much, Matthew. And yeah, it's been great to hear from everybody so far. And also really good, I think, that the discussion around trade and human rights is happening so vocally in the House of Commons at the moment. I was really interested to hear the sort of trade bill debate, and you, Emily, speaking so well about how it's, trade isn't just about trade. Trade is also about human rights. And if we're serious about global Britain, we need to think about both. So I think, obviously, we want the trade bill to go a certain way, but I think at the very least, it's great that these conversations are actually happening now around the need to think about trade and human rights together. So I just wanted to make that quick point. So I'm going to speak specifically around trade and women's rights. I think it's a sort of area that tends to be overlooked in the trade debate, and there's a lot of focus on environmental standards and human rights more generally, but often not quite enough focus on the disproportionate way in which trade affects women's rights. And the reality is that free trade by its nature creates winners and losers in all countries, and trade does not affect men and women equally. And this is partially because the expansion of global value chains as a result of trade liberalisation has created much needed jobs for women, which is a positive thing. These jobs are needed in countries in the global south. But women comprise 80 to 90% of the workforce producing clothes for UK brands. And it's widely known that these jobs are precarious and exploitative. They're fueled by a downward pressure on wages as countries in the global south, for example, in Bangladesh, Vietnam, India, they compete to attract investment from the global north. And this means that women don't have a lot of choice in terms of the jobs that are available to them. They're forced to accept jobs that are often very low wages, very poor working conditions, no social protection, and often without pension or maternity leave. And because they're sort of vulnerable to losing their jobs at a moment's notice, it makes them very vulnerable to abuse from their employers. And there was actually a study that happened back in Bangladesh back in 2019 of 4 of the biggest factories in Bangladesh. And it was found that every single woman working in that factory had either suffered, or all of them had suffered some form of verbal abuse, but they'd also all suffered the threat of losing their job by their employer. And I think that just sort of paints a small picture of the experience that women are facing in these roles. And COVID-19 has exacerbated this reality. So we know that millions of women have already been sent home, well, women and men, but predominantly women have been sent home as factories in Bangladesh have been forced to close, as brands have withdrawn contracts. And these women have been left destitute overnight. They've got no safety net, they don't have any right to unionize, and they go home and they have to look after their children, frequently without a pay packet. And this is a situation that can only really get worse after COVID subsides, because we know that retailers are going to need to open with a need to reduce their prices, which again will continue to drive down wages of the women producing clothes for us in the West. So this is a problem that is not going away. And in terms of the UK response, the UK government has sought to be very vocal in terms of championing a gender responsive approach to international trade. It definitely wants to be seen internationally to be taking trade and women's rights seriously. And we know this because it explicitly cites women's economic empowerment in the Conservative Party manifesto in relation to trade. And it's also been a real convener in terms of international fora like the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, CHOGM, where it's been vocal in sort of bringing states together around this issue of women's economic empowerment. And also most recently, it signed a deal with Japan that has what I understand to be a hard-won standalone chapter explicitly called Women's Economic Empowerment. So again, it wants to be seen to be progressive on this issue. And this is all really welcome and important. It's an issue that's been long called for by civil society organisations and women's rights organisations, both here in the UK and also in the Global South. ActionAid has a presence in 46 countries in the developing world, and we're really, this is something that our colleagues continue to call for as well, more recognition of issues around gender and trade. But the problem is that the UK's efforts to date are almost exclusively focused on increasing opportunities for women to enter into trade rather than challenging existing trading practices. So for example, if you look at the She Trades initiative, which again is a commendable programme, what it does is seeks to equip women to become entrepreneurs, to own their own businesses, to scale up their own businesses. And again, that's a really positive thing. But at the end of the day, a minority of women in the Global South have the opportunity to own their own businesses and have the opportunity to scale them up and to work in that sector. And that's for a number of reasons, many of which I won't go into, but one of the reasons is that many women have to work in unpaid care because of social and cultural reasons. They have to shoulder the large amount of unpaid care burden in their countries because they have to look after children, they have to look after elderly relatives. So often those business opportunities are not open to them. So while the She Trades and other similar programs are commendable, they have a narrow reach and they fall far behind the government's leave no one behind priority. And also, perhaps most importantly, this narrow focus on women in trade is feeding a trading ecosystem that is already structurally biased. So it's putting women into a system that is already biased against them. And the UK instead needs to recognise and mitigate against its contribution to economic inequality in the countries it trades with. But obviously this isn't all down to government. So for example, when we look back to the infamous collapse of the Rana Plaza factory back in 2019 in Bangladesh, we know that a lot of the press coverage around that fell on companies and around sort of UK brands that were sourcing their supplies and their garments from those factories in Bangladesh. And that's forced many companies to become a lot more diligent in terms of human rights and to be a lot more transparent about their supply chains. Obviously not all, but it is shining a light on the corporate side. But it's not shining much of a light in terms of what governments need to do in terms of recognising their own role in fueling economic injustice via trade and investment policy. So finally, what can the UK do to help mitigate these impacts and ensure trade is not just free, but fair? And I think firstly, and David covered this as well as the other panelists, but the trade bill needs to be seen as the opportunity that it is. And it's understandable that the government wants to narrow the scope of the bill to ensure continuity for UK businesses. and roll over deals as quickly as possible. But it is the only piece of trade legislation currently on the table. It's the only opportunity for the UK to set a standard in terms of UK trade and human rights, and women's rights in particular. And it's an opportunity to make sure that UK trade does not undermine development and the UK's significant aid budget and supports global Britain. So this is why ActionAid and myself would support the scrutiny amendment around a guaranteed debate and vote for MPs. And I think, Emily, you made a really important point during the trade bill debate where you said, we need safeguards or scrutiny, at least. We can't neither have safeguards nor scrutiny. And I think that's the problem here, is that if we're not going to have safeguards, we need to at least have a debate around how our trade policies impact human rights and women's rights, or we need to safeguard them through and I'm coming on to this, but the amendment around human rights risk assessments, which I think is a really important one, just to put a marker in the sand to say that this government does not trade with human rights abusers. Neither do we enter into a trade agreement if it undermines our own human rights obligations. So these are two amendments that I wanted to mention. And just to wrap up, I think, the Prime Minister has been very vocal in saying that he wants his government, he wants the UK to speak with one voice overseas. And he said this in the context of the merger of DFID with the Foreign Office. We need to speak with one voice, one foreign policy. But where does trade fall into this? Because at the moment, we're not seeing as a group, I think, a lot of consistency between how the UK wants to trade and its development and human rights priorities. So I think that's a real challenge for the UK and potentially for the forthcoming integrated review in terms of how it makes these things join up. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Isabelle. That's great. And I'm glad you mentioned parliamentary scrutiny at the end. It's a point I'd like us to maybe look at again now. David, I'm conscious you have to leave at 7:30, but you didn't really get the opportunity to talk about the parliamentary scrutiny side of things. Do you have anything to add on that?
I only sort of agree with what everyone said already, that it's just frankly quite ridiculous. If the government wants to build a new railway, they say like HS2, they have to get a bill through Parliament. That means a green paper, a white paper, things being announced, Commons being given time, the Commons going into committee taking evidence from people, the department probably do a public consultation, lots of people would submit to that, it would then go to the laws would amend it, get knocked back. All of this would happen for building a railway. If the government wants to sign a trade agreement with a country that commits genocide, they don't have to consult Parliament. MPs don't have to be told that negotiations have begun. During negotiations, there's no obligations for transparency. No one has to be updated. Afterwards, Parliament doesn't get a guaranteed vote. Ordinary people up and down the country assume that they can write into their MP and say, I'm concerned about this trade deal because of its effect on, human rights, genocide, or even food standards, the NHS, whatever it might be. They assume that their MP can stand up in the chamber, speak against the deal, and when push comes to shove, can vote against it if they want to. But that is not guaranteed. There is nothing in our system that ensures that process takes place. We're using, after Brexit, we revert to a system that we used for secret defense treaties after World War I. That's the same system that we'll be using for parliamentary scrutiny. So it's completely ridiculous. And it's an area where the UK lags behind Japan and the EU and the US, and lots of our trading partners have far, far better scrutiny processes in place. So it's the complete opposite of taking back control after Brexit.
Thanks. Just before we go then to questions, Emily, I want to check if you kind of want to go back to anyone on any of the points or want to add anything now.
I just think, I agree with everything that David has just said about parliamentary scrutiny, but let me just put in my halfpence worth as well. And I think that people need to kind of see it in the continuum whereby, because we've been in the European Union, we haven't been doing our own trade deals for 50 years. And so now what we need to do is we now have to work out, how do we trade? And it is a trade-off. When you do a trade deal, when you give preferential terms to another country, you have to think about a whole lot of things. You have to think about, in what way do you want to use it as a tool for foreign policy? Yeah, and what the conditions are that you want to add to that. You need to be making some hard-nosed decisions about some of your industries are going to suffer because you will be lowering tariffs to those particular countries, whereas other industries will do well. There will be winners and losers, and there needs to be a debate. Whitehall does not know best. Whitehall hasn't done any trade deals for more than 50 years. It might be a good idea to start listening and learning from people so that when you do enter a trade deal, you do it in such a way whereby you are informed by the public and by civic society and by the trade union movement and by all of the stakeholders, that you can do the kind of trade deal that actually Britain needs and wants, and there will have been a debate so that people do understand that there will be winners and losers. I mean, in my experience, when something happens, those who do well out of a decision that's been made tend to keep quiet, and it's the ones who don't do well are the ones who kick up. But we need to have had a debate throughout. And also, the way that modern trade deals are done, they do have a number of other purposes. You can do a number of other things, and we need to think about what kind of country are we and how do we want to express our values through our trade deals, and not be going back to the Ponsonby rule. Really? The 1920s is more than 100 years old. This is what they are relying on and hanging on to. And the trade bill is trade bills don't come around every day. We've got a trade bill, and this is a unique almost opportunity for us to set down a proper infrastructure for how it is that we're going to make decisions. How are we going to make decisions on trade? Because it can fundamentally change our country, and we can have a major influence on another country by the way in which we do our trade. And we need to start talking about that. We need to start educating ourselves about that. We need to start a debate. But the government is just closing down. And for the mother of parliaments to be behaving in such an extraordinarily anti-democratic way is really amazing, particularly when, we are thinking of signing up trade deals to countries who have a democratic system based on ours, but are now much more democratic, because we will get a trade deal kind of signed up notionally, conditionally signed, but then we have to wait whilst their parliament decides whether they want to ratify it or not, whereas our parliament gets no say at all. I mean, this is the current situation, and they are just belligerent about this and completely pig-headed and will not move on this issue. And frankly, it's wrong. And we're having a battle royal on it. And the trade bill went through Parliament, nearly got to the end of the process a couple of years ago, where all kinds of bits of democracy were hung on it. And the government got cross, withdrew the trade bill, so they weren't going to play anymore. It's like taking their ball away, and then had the general election, got their 80-seat majority, and then brought back the trade bill without any of the democratic safeguards or scrutiny that we'd added on it last time. So we've added it all on again. Where this will take us, I don't know, but we continue to fight.
If we're not able to get any of those amendments passed to the trade bill, what are going to be the other opportunities for Labour to try to push the government for a better system of parliamentary scrutiny before winning a general election?
So, I mean, I think, as Isabelle was saying, the point is that if we had some sort of democratic accountability, then actually an awful lot of the other things that have caused people such concern won't arise. So, whether it's our food standards or human rights, whatever it is, people would say, well, Parliament is going to have the final say on this, so they will need to listen. But because we don't have that scrutiny, people are then saying, well, we need to make sure that we have a safeguard on here and here. And what they've done is they've pulled in a safeguard here, particularly because of the strength of the farming lobby. They've done a little bit here and a little bit there. So I always say, I think the bill at the moment looks like it's been dragged through a hedge backwards, because it has been an absolute kind of fight. It is a bit of a mess, but there are a few things here and there, and there are bodies set up here and there. But it isn't a proper overview of democratic scrutiny in the way that it ought to be. There are two government committees, parliamentary committees. There's one in the Commons, and then the Lords have just set one up. Good for them. The Lords have been behaving amazingly during the whole of the trade bill negotiations. They've just set up a trade committee, just said, well, we're just going to do it. And so they will be doing a certain amount of scrutiny, and we will too. And, you know, we've embarrassed the government into saying, oh, we're going to allow there to be scrutiny. We will have debates. We will have this. We will have that. But only out of, you know, the largesse of government, you know, because they're feeling generous, will they let us have a debate. They made an announcement over the weekend about us, you know, applying to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as David referred to. Has there been a debate? Did she make a statement to Parliament? Were we able to ask any questions? No. I have a speech, I've written it. It was ready to go. I was expecting it to appear in Parliament today. You'd think she would. She didn't. And I suspect one of the problems that she has, particularly at the moment, is with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and something she does need to answer, and I've asked her several times, is if we're in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, whatever other problems there may be with it, China has said that it wants to join. We have said that we want to join. Do we have a veto on China joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Is this fantasy? I don't know. I don't know any details about it. But we have had no accountability. We have had no proper debate. We have not had the details given to us. They cannot give us a clear answer on that, because if they did, they wouldn't have such problems. And of course, given the atmosphere in Parliament at the moment about genocide amendment and about the Uyghurs and about China, they don't want to find themselves in an embarrassing position whereby they can't answer that question about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, people might say there's no way China would join. Well, who knows? And it's open to it to join, and it says that it wants to. Who knows how it's going to develop? I mean, the Trans-Pacific Partnership has been in the doldrums somewhat since America didn't join. It was largely set up with an idea that America was going to be the leading power. America hasn't joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Who knows where it will go next?
If I could just come in, Matthew, just in response to your question, if we don't win what we want to win on the trade bill, what happens? So I think three things we could see. One is a lot of public frustration and campaigning with each new trade deal that comes in. I think particularly with the US, the European Parliament put in place more democratic safeguards because of the level of public opposition there was to TTIP, the proposed EU-US trade agreement. There was a lot of anger about ordinary people and MEPs being kept in the dark about those negotiations, and that triggered a lot of civil society action. So I think that's one thing we would see if Parliament isn't given those scrutiny powers. Another one is, I think you just see chaos. The kind of border chaos that we've seen following the EU deal is that stuff will get missed, because that's what scrutiny is for. It's not just about Parliament slowing things down or stopping things. You will see things go wrong, things that businesses, the public, scrutiny committees might have picked up on if there had been better transparency, but things will go wrong and businesses will get angry. I've been in meetings with businesses and civil servants. Normally, we think of ourselves as quite an anti-corporate, left-wing radical organization, but we've been agreeing with the CBI, the International Chambers of Commerce, the British Chambers of Commerce, on pretty much everything, because all of us feel left in the dark and clueless about what the government's trade priorities are because of the lack of transparency. And lastly, and this is very much speculation, but I wonder if we might see some litigation as well. I think the Miller case was based on the lack of parliamentary involvement in the triggering of Article 50, which was deemed to affect British citizens' rights, and that's why the court accepted the case. And trade agreements do affect rights. They affect investor protection, they affect data rights, online privacy, food standards, all sorts of things that you could argue are a fundamental change to the rights enjoyed by people in Britain. And if Parliament isn't involved in that kind of thing, even though it's an international treaty, which is the executive's prerogative, I think you could see legal cases. And in fact, our friends at Global Justice Now have been involved with legal cases around the level of information that was made public in the US negotiations already. And this is just at the start. That was before we'd even adopted independent trade policy. So I think you might see legal cases as well.
I mean, I agree. And I agree with all of that. But I also think that this idea that it is the executive's prerogative because it's an international treaty is just not thinking things through, given how profoundly a trade deal can change matters. And there is no need for them to just sign something on behalf of the Queen. And you're right, let's take, for example, the issue of data. You have to have the same kind of fundamental rules on data. Clearly, if we're going to have a deal with the European Union on data, does that line up with the rules in our Japan deal? Does it, is it possible that data flows from Europe to Japan and then to America? If Japan have different rules, I mean, there is a serious argument about that. And certainly within the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they will have different rules in relation to data than the ones within Europe. And then what happens? Do the Europeans say, well, we're afraid we've got to protect our data. We can't just let you send it off to the Trans-Pacific Partnership who are just going to, mess around with it. And, I mean, you cannot do that. And then what happens to our insurance industry if they don't have the data of people with whom they have contracts? They're not allowed to store it. They're not allowed to store European data in relation to that, for example. There has to be systematic thinking through and not just a kind of collecting as many trade deals as possible so that Liz Truss can stand in front of brightly coloured flags. There is more to this than that. And we need to have a proper strategy, which does mean a proper engagement. Sorry, I keep going. Please shut me up because I will.
Agreed. Okay, well, so let's go then to questions from the audience now. If I invite people to raise their hands if they have any questions, then we can bring people in, basically. Does anyone have any questions? A sea of hands hasn't appeared in my panel.
I can see a question about reconciling the trade policy with our immigration policy, which I think is a question which appears in the chat, which I think is something that needs to be thought through, particularly given that these days it isn't in a trade deal. It isn't just about trading in widgets. You need to have quite often somebody to service the widgets. You need to have not only the space age photocopier that you sell to Sweden, but you then have to have a contract that Brits will go out and service it and look after it. And this is kind of part of, you get a connection between objects and people. And certainly when we have had scoping conversations with India, for example, on whether or not there could be a trade deal with India, they have said, great, let's have a trade deal. But we also need to have changes to the immigration policy because we need to be able to have people going backwards and forwards as well as goods, to which the British just said, no. And so therefore the trade talks went no further. So these days it isn't just goods, it's also expertise that needs to be traveled backwards and forwards. And we are a long way behind working out the best way of doing trade deals to support our service industry. I mean, 80% of our economy is services. So when we're talking about trade, we're only really talking about stuff at the moment. But we need to be thinking much more widely about that, how we actually support the reality of our economy. That does mean allowing people to travel backwards and forwards, both Brits away, to do that and the other way too. If we don't maintain that openness, then we won't be able to maintain modern trade, which is, the sort of trade that we need for our modern economy.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks for spotting that question. We've now got a live question from Bridget.
Thank you. Very, very impressed by all the speakers, including Isabelle, who talked about issues on which I have campaigned for decades. And I mentioned in my brief piece that I speak as a recent business owner who founded a business on ethical investment, sold it into employee ownership with millions under investment. I am not speaking as some sort of far off the radar radical, active in the City of London and so on. But the Labour Party, I feel, must practice what it preaches. Diversity is not in evidence. And in my written comment, I've already pointed out the things that are going on. My conscience won't let me stay silent. The Labour Party is no longer a place of diversity, of free speech, and I remain very, very concerned. I am not able to say much more because we know what's happened to people that have said more. Words fail. I hope ECHR will pay great attention to what is actually happening inside and to the Labour Party. Do you have any concerns about this, Matthew?
This is certainly something we can discuss separately, but I don't want to take up too much time. We've only got 15 minutes left to talk about these trade and human rights issues.
I know, but there are so many avenues for raising concern. I'm putting that one and happy to park it, but
yeah, flagged.
It won't
sure. Unless Emily has a burning desire to come back, but I'd rather keep it to trade issues just for now. All right, thanks, Bridget. Noted, and we can pick it up separately. David has had to go, of course, because it's 7:30 now. I don't see any other hands up, but let me just check if there are other questions in the chat. I think there are. So
I think Omar's asked a question, hasn't he?
Has Omar asked a question? Here we go. Omar's question: how do you deal with concerns that refusing to do trade deals on human rights grounds will hurt ordinary citizens of the relevant countries more than others? Putting it another way, what's the prospect of including human rights in trade deals, speeding the move to liberal democracy? Isabelle, I just saw you nodding. Okay, perfect. I'll bring you.
Question, and just to clarify, is the question, if we make it harder to do trade deals with developing countries, is that's going to affect citizens in developing countries? Is that the sentiment? Just so I check, I understand. Yeah,
I think so.
Okay, good. So I think that's a really good point, and it's a sort of common issue that we deal with when we talk about trying to make sure that factories, particularly in countries of the global south, are offering decent work for women who are producing goods for us in the global north. And there's a risk, obviously, that we therefore, if we raise labour standards and we make sure that we exclude certain provisions, or we include certain provisions that would ensure a minimal level of labour standard and human rights and working conditions, that it would therefore make it more difficult for these factories and more expensive for these factories to function, and therefore women in those factories could lose their jobs. And I think that's an absolutely valid point. I think there are a couple of issues with looking at it like that. I think one of them is that I would rather not look, you can look at it in that way, but you can also look at it as making it easier for more ethical businesses, more ethical suppliers in those countries to function well and to profit and to be able to employ women and men and provide them with decent work. So I think it's to look at it the flip side. You're also making it easier for ethical factories to profit and to work more freely. So I think that's one side of it. But I think there's also an issue around, it's a difficult argument to say, surely a job is better than no job at all. Because I think then you get into really difficult ground around the precedent that sets around decent work. And that's the whole reason we have human rights and why we have the right to decent work, is that it sets a minimum level that is acceptable in terms of the right to work. So I think it's dangerous territory to say, well, at least they've got a job, or at least, they're in employment, because we wouldn't necessarily accept that in the global north. And I think the UK definitely shouldn't be driving that narrative, but should actually be setting a higher standard, or seeking to set a higher standard through its trade deals. And I think if it doesn't do that, then it's falling far short of what it calls a sort of global Britain agenda. So I think that's what I would say about that, but I appreciate it's a really difficult question. And I also think that these conversations need to happen with women in the global south that are sort of juggling work and juggling childcare, and in poor working conditions in factories. Those conversations need to be had with them, and that's why impact assessments around trade deals are so important, to make sure that we get it right.
Yeah, that's great, Isabelle. And actually, I'd quite like to go to Emily on that, but there's a related question from someone else. Again, it's about the sort of practical concerns about trying to put human rights standards in and what it can mean in practice. So this is a question from Alexandra. Do you fear that trade deals will take too long and could span years and decades if we set the human rights bar too high? Would it not be worth securing trade deals and then addressing human rights abuses afterwards? So Emily, I don't know if you want to come back on both of those practical questions.
There have been examples of when I was doing quite a lot of work on food standards, and the same, the argument being the same, really. We have trade deals with, what about countries in Africa? How can we insist that there be that they maintain a food production standards that we can do in the West, but it's much more difficult in the developing world. But actually, what we saw was that, in fact, on the back of trade deals, where certain standards are kept or put up, then the suppliers rose to the challenge, and actually changes were made, and that it was a catalyst for change within those countries, or that there were different farming practices. And so it just reminded me of that. The wider question was about, do we want to get hung up on human rights when we're supposed to be agreeing trade deals around the world? Well, I mean, I think the reality is that trade deals do take years. I mean, they just do. You know, a proper trade deal has to be comprehensive, and so therefore, and it can't just be like little bits. You're not allowed to do that, really. You've got to have a comprehensive trade deal, which has got to go through all areas according to the WTO rules. And so when you're doing that, you can do one which has human rights provisions. And I think an example of doing it badly is in the Colombian trade deal. So the Europeans had a deal with Colombia where they had some pretty rubbish human rights provisions in the Colombian deal, and everybody kind of knew it, and there was a big row about it in Europe, but eventually they sort of stuck to the rubbish conditions. And then there was the peace, the shaky peace that was agreed, that everyone was so happy about. And then of course there was another government elected who were elected with a very with a distinctly, not believing in the peace process, and actively undermining it, and the number of deaths has gone up. And then we sign our new our new trade deal with Colombia, and all we do is we roll over the European one, which includes all the rubbish human rights conditions, instead of having some modern ones, where we could say that we do not expect to continue to trade with Colombia if the death toll continues to be at the level that it is, actually being able to put some kind of teeth into that, and threatening, to not trade with Colombia if it doesn't, and we do a lot of trade with Colombia. I mean, actually for Colombia, trade with Britain is kind of quite important. And furthermore, in the Security Council, we hold the pen on the Colombian peace process. So how can we, as the who's been given a world leadership role by being on the Security Council and having specifically the job of trying to support the peace process, how can we have a trade deal with Colombia that has human rights provisions that don't even recognize that there has been a peace deal done in Colombia, let alone one that has human rights provisions that are up to date, but instead relies on human rights provisions that are more than a decade old, and weren't very good when they were agreed anyway. I mean, it's just an example of just doing things in a sloppy way and not doing them in a disciplined way, and something which could have made a difference, actually. And when you speak to Colombian trade unionists, they are desperate and so profoundly disappointed that Britain has let them down.
Thanks. We've got about 7 or so minutes left, 6 or 7 minutes, and we've got another good question which has come in, and I think this is a chance to bring Rahima back in too. The question is, in a context where international preventative mechanisms are failing, how effective can bilateral trade deals become for enacting disciplinary measures against countries to uphold human rights? So how effective are they actually as tools to affect change? And then how do you separate humanitarian criticism of China's treatment of the Uyghurs from right-wing opportunist attacks on the China government? Both good questions, I think. Rahima, do you just want to quickly come back on those questions, or anything else that's been covered since you last spoke? You're on mute.
Okay. China is behaving like this at the moment, bullying all the other countries, like, the African countries, and including like Turkey and Pakistan and many Muslim countries, using their diplomatic power, economic power, and to even sign a letter to support the camp system, you can just see the power of money here. and the power of money that, when this government started the golden era, the trade and knowing what is happening to Tibetans. And at that time, I mean, Uyghur issue wasn't so globalized, even though the situation was so bad. Even back in 2000, I left my country because of the massacre in my city. Therefore, I do strongly believe that it was a mistake that for China to be in the WTO when it didn't meet the standard. The human rights abuse was so bad. I was in Tiananmen Square in 1989. I left the square on the 2nd of June. Thousands of students killed on the 4th of June. But there wasn't enough outrage from all this, the democratic countries, and allowed China to unconditionally to become powerful, lifting poverty. And we all hoped that once this kind of economic problems, don't forget 1.3 billion people in China, that, of course it is important that people's living condition to improve. Again, it's a very important rights for the people, but the human rights abuse is just unprecedented, absolutely horrific. And especially since she took power, Xi Jinping, 2013, not only just the Uyghurs, Tibetans, look, the human rights lawyers, they were imprisoned. Throughout China, this government is terrorizing its own citizens. And now look at Hong Kong, what is happening to Hong Kong. So therefore, I don't think the trade should be the unconditional. That should be, there is a very strict condition. We are not talking about just human rights abuse here. We are talking about the genocide. The genocide is happening. Imagine the Holocaust, if no one really interfered, even after 6 million were killed. Imagine what would have happened, Therefore, I think it is important. These issues are extremely important. The only way that you can stop China, now you can punish China, is through trade and we are not asking you go to war and liberate those millions of people. That this is a list that the countries that can do. And we know this country, and including UK, the dependency, you need, because of the dependency, then you have very little power. So the second question was about the right-wing opportunist or whatever. Look, my campaign is cross-party, cross-community campaign. I'm not a politician. I am not, into these different ideologies whatsoever. I welcome anyone who support the Uyghur struggle at the moment. Regardless what party or what ideology you represent, but if you feel that this is, if you are appalled because of hearing what is happening to my people, then I do welcome all the supports. Just you put yourself in my shoes and then think about it. When you are drowning in the water, when someone gives you a hand, you are not going to consider, you're not going to say, oh, you are not the right person, please don't, you have to save yourself first. So in this kind of situation, I do have a lot of people question me about this. And I just say, well, you are not in my situation. You don't know what I am, going through every single day. Therefore, don't question me, you know, don't question me, and don't bring other issues into this, because this is a very different issue. What the Uyghurs are happening. It's not just about a Muslim issue. This is a human issue, you know, that human beings are now facing, as a group, as a people, are facing genocide. Therefore, I really hope people can understand the Uyghur situation and all come together, regardless of, you know, whatever political opinion that you have. And I know, like Lord Alton, for example, he's conservative. He is the one who bring this trade genocide amendment to the trade bill. And we are very lucky to have the, you know, Labour very strong support on this, and the Liberal Democrat as well. We had 33 Conservative MPs voted for this, and we need more. And therefore, I'm not going to criticize anyone. I will encourage people to help and support Uyghur people.
Can I just come back on the on Parliament? I mean, the bottom and top of this is that the Tories have an 80-seat majority. 80-seat majority. I mean, no government has had an 80-seat majority for, well, I just don't know how long. I mean, probably Tony Blair. You know, it's just, it's very difficult in those circumstances to run an effective opposition. We are an effective opposition. We're doing bloody well. And the reason that we do well is because we put forward our arguments well, but also because, you know, we are pragmatic and are able to put our arm around all kinds of people and work together with them. There is no other way. We're not going to just sit on our side and make great speeches and go, oh, look how clean our hands are. No, we're going to work with whoever we can in order to try to at least put a few steps in the right direction, even if we don't get all the way. And so that's what we're doing. You know, politics can be a dirty business, but, you know, so long as you keep where it is you want to get to at the forefront of your mind, and you know you're going in the right direction, you just do what you can. I mean, the general election was a disaster. It was a disaster. Not only losing it, but losing it so badly. And obviously, you know, the side effect of that is not only that we have this dreadful government in for the amount of time that it does, but also there was no more argument about leaving the European Union. We just left. All of this is a disaster. We just have to pick ourselves up and do what we can. And that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I agree with the point that it's not really necessary for us to make that distinction at the moment when we're working, when there is bipartisan cooperation on an issue like this. It's quite nice. To illustrate the point, I sit on this advisory group for Rahima along with representatives from the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, and the chair of the Conservative Commission for Human Rights and I have a joint call to action tomorrow in the Times for support for this amendment. And we highlight the fact it's rare for voices to come together, activists in particular, from two different parties. But we are united on this, and we should be pleased for it at the moment, I think. I want to give Emily a final right of reply to anything if you have anything final to add. Otherwise, I can very quickly wrap up.
No, I don't think so. I think it's been a really interesting meeting. As I say, I think that this is something which is going to be at the forefront of progressive thinking, you know, for the next few years. I think, you know, we need to start making policy on this pretty fast. And we need to start, you know, more of these sorts of debates so that people can think through what it is. I mean, I remember when I went to South Africa and I was shadow Foreign Secretary, I went to New Zealand, Australia, people talked very comfortably about trade, about what trade meant, about compromises, about how it worked in a way that we just haven't done, and we need to start doing now. And we need to start pulling together as Labour what it is that we stand for by way of, I mean, I think I know, but I'm definitely up for hearing what people think and learning from it so that we can start putting together a principled Labour policy on trade.
Which is a very good segue into the final note I want to add at the end, which is we haven't addressed this issue head on in this talk, but a thread that's sort of gone through the whole thing is corporates. Corporate behavior is obviously part of this, as well as what governments can do. And so in due course, we'll be holding another webinar on corporate supply chains and human rights. And like I mentioned at the start, whether one of these flagship policies that you mentioned, Emily, might be something like a Human Rights Due Diligence Act, to put a legal obligation on companies to look into their supply chains and identify and prevent human rights abuses.
And also, I think we've talked about this before, also to highlight, where it is that there's stuff within the environment bill at the moment.
Yeah.
Isn't there?
Yeah.
And to widen that out, or to try to widen it out, and to try to sort of engage people in the debate on that issue at this stage, because we're obviously not going to be in a position to be able to introduce legislation because with the opposition,
agreed.
Majority.
We're not far off. We've got the Modern Slavery Act. We've got the Environment Bill with that obligation on illegal forested products. We've got common law developments. There's case law going in this direction in the Supreme Court. And we've got developments in Europe happening. So the winds are blowing in this direction. And I hope Labour gets in front of it. I'm sure it will. Fantastic. Okay. Look, finally, just to say thank you, first of all, to the panelists. Really, really grateful to have you all here. Really grateful for your insights. And it's been an interesting dynamic discussion. Second of all, thank you to the LCHR committee, all your hard work. These briefings are great pieces of policy suggestions, and events like this are important. And finally, thank you to all the attendees. We're really grateful for you joining this discussion, and hopefully you've got something out of this. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.